Let's now build the really cool slider component. And this is going to be a lot of work, so we're doing that in 2 parts. And so here goes part 1. So this is what the final version of the slider looks like. So we can click these buttons here to move between the slides, and you see that also the dot down here then changes. And as we reach the last slide, as indicated by this last dot, if we then go to the next one, it will basically go back to the first one like this. And of course, we can also click on the dots like this. Now, right? So let's now understand how this is actually implemented in terms of HTML and CSS, because as always, that's a very important aspect to make this all work. Okay. So this is the slider component. And then each slider has a couple of slides. So 3 slides. And they are, in fact, all side by side. So we have slide 1. Make this smaller here, because the content doesn't really matter. So we have these 3 slides. And so you see here by this blue area that they are all side by side. So here in the slider, we can turn off this overflow property, which is set to hidden. And then you can actually see the next slide already waiting there, basically. So what happens when we click this button is that all the slides move a little bit to the left side. So watch. And so you see that now the first slide is here, the second is in the middle, and the third is right here. And that happens by using this transform CSS property, which we then set to translate X. And then here we define these values to basically move each of the slides as we click these buttons. So watch what happens here in these values as I click. And so now the last slide here is basically at 0%. The one before is at -100, and the one before is at -200. So minus is basically to the left, and the width of each slide is 100. And so basically, this is all we need to do in order to make the slide work. So basically adapt these percentages here as we go. So you see that now the first slide is at 0%, then the other one at 100, and the third one, which is all the way to the right side, is now at 200%. So this is basically the starting position of the slider. And let's compare that to what we have currently in our slider. So we have all of the slides basically on top of each other right now. And so the first thing that we should do here is to basically establish this initial condition where they are all side by side. So like this. And so what we're going to do on each of them is to set this transform property to these percentages. But of course, all automatically. So let's start here with our slider. And as always, I'm going to start with some selections. So starting with the slider, or actually with the slides themselves, so that we can then manipulate them. So document.query selector all. And so that's a slide. So with the class of slide. And we can also, of course, see that here in our own HTML. So you see, here we have the slide. Now the content that is inside of each of these slides is completely irrelevant for our purposes. All right, so all we are concerned with is the slider element and then this slide. So this one and all the others. So I can collapse these just to see. And so, yeah, we are only going to be concerned with the slides. And then you can maybe use this for your own projects in the future and put whatever you want inside these slides. For example, you could just have images or really anything that you want. And in fact, that's what I have down here. So here I only have some images. And maybe we should actually work with that. So let's actually try that. So I will comment out this part. So not really sure how that works anymore. Now, okay. And so now let's make this actually visible. Just to see. All right. So these are our slides now, but once again, they are all on top of each other. And we can see that here when we inspect them. So indeed, all of these slides are in the same position. And so let's create that starting condition that I mentioned a minute ago. So putting all the slides side by side. So let's take the slides and we're going to loop through them and set the style on each of them. So let's create a simple arrow function here. And the parameters I will just call s for slide. And then we also need the second one, which is the index. And you will see in a minute why that is. And so here we want to set the style on each of the sides. And remember, it is the transform property that we want to set. So transform. And then we want to set it to translate x. And then here is where we have to specify the value. Okay? And that value is going to be in percentages. And let me just write down here what we want. So the first slide should be at 0%. The second should be at 100%, then 200%, and then 300%. Okay? And so that's because translate x will basically move them to position 100%. So the width of each of these images is 100%. And so then the second image will start right here at the end of the first one. Then the third one will start right after the first one, which is at position 200%, and then 300. So how can we calculate these values here? Well, we can simply multiply 100%. So here we need now a JavaScript value. So we can multiply 100% by the current index. So in the beginning, that's going to be 0. So 0 times 100 is 0. And then, as you see, it will go all the way until 300, because in this case, we have 4 images, or 4 slides. But if we were working with the other slides, then that would only go to 200%, because we only have 3 slides. So that should already be enough. And now we have this problem that our sections here keep disappearing, and that's because the code we wrote earlier, so reveal sections. And so for now, let's remove this observer. All right. Well, the observer can actually stay. What we need to remove is these hidden classes. All right, so now that works. And so let's check out the images now. And we can't really see them. All right, but indeed, they have now 0%, 100, 200, 300, and so on and so forth. Let's maybe temporarily scale down the entire slider. So let's come here to, or let's do that actually here in JavaScript. So just to make this a little bit easier for us to see. So const slider is document.query selector slider. And then what I want to do is slider.style.transform and set it to scale, let's say 0.5. Yeah, so that looks a bit better. Now we just need to change that overflow that I just showed you before. So that overflow here, we need to set to visible. So also on the slider. So otherwise we cannot see the other slides, right? So let's do that as well. So overflow, and we need to set it to hidden, or actually to visible. Now, okay, let's make this even smaller actually. Even smaller, just so we can see all the images. So you see, now all the 4 of them are here, and our buttons are now really small, so they are still here, but I think we will be able to work with this. Maybe we can just move the whole thing a little bit to the left. So let's say translate x here as well. And keep in mind that this has nothing to do with the functionality. Okay, this is just so we can see what we are doing here. So this works. Or we can move it even further. And so now we can make it a bit bigger again. All right. So that's beautiful. That works for now. And then by the end, we will simply remove all of this. Okay. But now let's actually get to work and make the slider work. And so I will start by selecting these two buttons. So that's the button left, query selector. Let's see here. So that's slider button left and button right. And then simply duplicate it. Okay. So button right dot add event listener. And let's start by only working now to make the slide go right. So clicking just on this button here. And I think we're not even going to need the event for now. Okay, so this is basically to go to the next slide. So remember that going to the next slide is basically simply changing the value here in the transform property. So this translate x, all we will do is to change the percentages so that basically the slide that we want to move to is the one that has 0%. So remember that this is what we did here. So right now, the active one is the one that has 0%, and the previous one has -100, and the other 100. So again, that is the whole mechanism that we're using here to move the slides. And so this is what we will do now. So in the beginning, we are at slide 0, but then when we want to go to the next slide, we need to increase that. So let's outside here create a new variable for the current slide. So let current slide, and it is a let because we will of course then update it. So we start at 0, and then when we go to the next slide, we simply increase that by 1. All right, and so right now it is 1. And then what we need to do is to basically do the same as this, but with a small change. All right. So let's say that the current slide is 1. Then we do not want this here, right? We don't want this, but instead we want the first slide to be -100, this one 0, this one 100, and the other one 200. So how do we do that? Well, we take the current index, and then we subtract the current slide. So again, we will take this, so each slide that we're looping over, and then minus the current slide, so like this, and then this will give us exactly what we want. So again, let's say that the current slide is 1. Let's write that here, actually. And so then, as we loop over these slides, in the first iteration, this will be 0, and then 0 minus 1 will be -1. And then times 100 is, of course, -100. Then the next slide, the index is 1, and then 1 minus 1 is 0, and so that will then become 0%. And so remember that the active slide is exactly the one that we want to be 0%. And so this should now actually work. Let's see. And yeah, it is already moving. So the first part is already doing its job, but now we are kind of at the last slide here. So let's see what happens next. So it actually keeps going. So the number of slides keeps increasing, and so of course these values here also keep increasing because, well, JavaScript doesn't know that we are working a slider, and so of course it doesn't stop. We need to tell it to stop. So how can we do that? Well, the best way is to actually define the number of slides and then make it stop once we reach the last one. So let's say that the max slide, so the maximum slide where we can go, is slides.length. So basically the length of this node list here. And on node lists, we can also read the length property just like on an array. So here when we define the value of the current slide, we now need to update this a little bit. And so if we are at the max slide, so if the current slide is equal to the max slide, then we want the current slide to become 0 again. And so that's how we return to the beginning of the slides. And otherwise, we will simply increase the slides by 1. Okay, so let's test that here. So everything keeps working. Now we are at slide number 3, and so we are at the end. But actually this max slide is 4. So the length is 4, but the index is 3. And so as always, that's because the length is not 0 based. And so probably it will keep going one more time, and then it will return to the beginning. Yeah, beautiful. All we need to change here is to add -1 to this to basically also make this 0 based. And so now, let's see. Well, our slider is basically already working. So at least in this direction. So this button, of course not, but here we can see that it's doing its job already. So that's really nice. Let's now just quickly refactor this code a little bit. So we have here basically the exact same code, or at least almost the same code as here. But we can refactor this into its own function. So let's grab this here. And I will create a function now called goToSlide. So that's a function where we pass in the slide. So basically the number of the slide where we want to go to. And then here we change the current slide to the slide that we are indicating. And here I can then call this goToSlide with the current slide. So far we didn't change anything. Just delete this comment here. And now to be able to remove this part here, all we need to do is to basically call this function here right in the beginning of our code with the slide set to 0. So this slide argument set to 0. And so what this will do is then basically once our application starts, it immediately goes to slide 0. And so that will then execute basically this code. So slide will be 0, and so I minus 0 is then of course just I. And so that's then exactly what we have here. So go to slide 0. And so now I can delete this, and that's great. Then to make this just a bit more beautiful, let's actually also take this one here and create a new function for that. So const next slide, and then put it here. And this one doesn't need any parameters because the goal of this is really just to export the functionality into its own named function. All right. And so indeed it keeps working just as before. Next up, let's then work on this button here. And so all I need to do is to add an event listener to button left. Also click, and then I'm going to create a function called previous slide, or just prev slide. So let me create that here very quick as well. So const prev slide. And so in this case, the current slide will be decreased. And then here, I can simply reuse the same function that I already wrote before, and also with the current slide. So the functionality of moving to a slide is of course exactly the same, no matter if we go forward or upward. So all this will do is to update the transform property on all of the slides. And that works in always the same way, no matter if we're going forwards or backwards. So the main difference between the next and the previous slide is really the way in which we determined the current slide. So when we go to the next slide, we basically increase the current slide, and when we go backwards, so to the previous slide, we simply decrease it. So let's try that now. And first we need to go forward because our function there is not really complete. But in this situation, it already works just fine. But then as we keep going, we have the same problem as before, because we simply keep decreasing the current slide. And so we now need to fix that. All right. So in which situation does simply decreasing the current slide not work? So it works right now. So now it works, right? But now it does not work. And so that is in the situation where the current slide is already 0. So let's write if the current slide is 0. So in this case, the current slide should be equal to the max slide. And again, that's -1 because that max slide is not 0-based. And then else. And so now that should actually work. And indeed, beautiful. And so now our slider is actually working already. We are just missing a couple of features. So namely, these dots here, which is a little bit complicated to implement. And also in this version, we can use the arrow left and arrow right functions to move through the slider. All right, so now I'm just hitting the left button and the right button. Okay, but I'm gonna leave that for the next video. For now, let's just get rid of these things that we did in the beginning so that we can see the actual slider in all its beauty. So now it does indeed look like a real slider, doesn't it? So I'm really happy with this result, and I hope that you're as well. And of course, I wouldn't expect you to be able to write this code on your own just yet. So when we implement something like this, there is a lot of stuff to think about, and especially in this case, the most tricky part is, in my opinion, this here. And this probably comes from experience, and so at a certain point, if you practice enough, you will also be able to come up with a logic like this. So I just invite you to study this code here a little bit before we move on. And once you're done doing that, then let's move on and implement these dots at the bottom of the slider that I just showed you.